In August 1950, a forward aid station sat on the summit of a 3,000-foot mountain in Korea. Inside, a soldier was dying. He'd been shot. He was bleeding out, and the enemy had cut off every escape route to the rear. There was no way to evacuate him by ground. No ambulance could reach him. No jeep could get through. The soldier was going to die on that mountain. And then someone had an idea. What if we fly him out? Not with a plane, with a helicopter. It had never been done before. Not like this. Not under these conditions. But Captain Oscar Tibbets and his crew from the 3rd Air Rescue Squadron said they'd try. They flew into enemy territory, landed on that mountain, loaded the wounded soldier onto their helicopter, and flew him to safety. The mission was a success. The soldier's life was saved. And in that moment, everything changed. The helicopter had just proven it could do something no one thought possible. It could save lives on the battlefield. What followed was a revolution in military medicine. Over the next 3 years, helicopters would evacuate more than 21,000 casualties from the Korean War. They would cut the death rate for wounded soldiers almost in half, from 4.5% in World War II to 2.5% in Korea. They would prove that speed saves lives, that the golden hour between injury and surgery was the difference between living and dying. And they would change warfare forever. This is the story of the Bell H-13, the small, fragile helicopter with 2 external litter pods. The helicopter that couldn't fly at night, couldn't operate in bad weather, and had no armor protection. The helicopter that pilots flew anyway, into enemy fire, into mountains, into impossible situations, because lives depended on it. This is the story of how one machine changed everything. Let's begin. Before the Korean War, evacuating wounded soldiers was slow, brutal, and deadly. In World War II, if you were wounded on the front lines, you faced a long, agonizing journey to get medical care. First, medics would stabilize you as best they could with whatever they had. Then you'd be loaded onto a stretcher. If you were lucky, you'd be carried to a jeep or an ambulance. If you weren't lucky, you'd be carried by hand, over rough terrain, under fire, for miles. The ride in a World War II ambulance was a nightmare. No suspension, no padding. Every bump, every pothole, every rock sent waves of pain through your body. If you had internal injuries, the jostling could kill you. If you were bleeding, the delay could kill you. If you went into shock, the time it took to reach a hospital could kill you. And time was the enemy. In World War II, it could take hours to get a wounded soldier from the front lines to a field hospital. Sometimes it took days. By the time a seriously wounded man reached surgery, he'd already lost too much blood. His body had gone into shock. His chances of survival had dropped dramatically. The numbers tell the story. In World War II, 4.5% of soldiers who reached medical care still died from their wounds. That might not sound like much, but think about what that means. These were men who survived the battlefield, who made it to doctors, who were supposed to be saved. And nearly 1 in 20 of them died anyway, because they didn't get help fast enough. The military knew this was a problem. They knew that time was killing soldiers, but they didn't have a solution. Ambulances were too slow. Fixed-wing aircraft needed runways and couldn't land near the front. There was no way to get wounded men to surgery quickly. Until the helicopter. The problem was, in 1950, helicopters were new, experimental, untested. The military had a few of them, but they were used for search and rescue missions, picking up downed pilots, that kind of thing. No one had seriously considered using helicopters to evacuate wounded soldiers from the battlefield. It seemed impossible. Helicopters were fragile. They couldn't carry much weight. They were vulnerable to ground fire. They couldn't fly at night or in bad weather. And there just weren't very many of them. But all of that was about to change, because the Korean War was about to prove that impossible was just another word for not tried yet. June 25th, 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The attack was overwhelming. The South Korean army collapsed. American forces rushed to help, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the first months of the war, United Nations forces were pushed back to the Pusan perimeter, a small defensive line in the southeast corner of Korea. Casualties were enormous. Thousands of men were wounded, and the medical system was struggling to cope. The terrain in Korea made everything worse. Mountains, narrow roads, mud. In the rainy season, roads became impassable. Ambulances got stuck. Supply lines broke down. Wounded soldiers waited for hours, sometimes days, to be evacuated. Men were dying not because their wounds were untreatable, but because they couldn't get to a hospital in time. The military medical system needed a solution, and they needed it fast. Enter the helicopter. In July 1950, the Air Force deployed the 3rd Air Rescue Squadron to Korea. It was commanded by Captain Oscar Tibbets. The squadron's mission was to rescue downed air crews. They flew Sikorsky H-5 helicopters, small machines with a single pilot and room for maybe 1 or 2 passengers. The H-5 was better than nothing, but it wasn't designed for medical evacuation. It was slow, it had limited range, and it couldn't carry much weight. But it could land almost anywhere. And in Korea's mountainous terrain, that made all the difference. Then came that mission in August 1950. The forward aid station on the mountain. The wounded soldier cut off by enemy forces. Captain Tibbets and his crew flew in, picked up the soldier, and flew him to safety. The mission proved something critical. Helicopters could evacuate wounded soldiers from places ground vehicles couldn't reach. They could do it quickly, and they could save lives. The army took notice. If helicopters could rescue 1 soldier from a mountain, maybe they could rescue hundreds. Maybe they could change the entire medical evacuation system. Maybe they could save thousands of lives. In November 1950, the Army requested 4 helicopter detachments specifically for medical evacuation. Not search and rescue, medical evacuation. It was a radical idea, and it was about to become one of the most important innovations of the entire war. In January 1951, 4 Army helicopter detachments arrived in Korea. These were the units that would prove the concept of helicopter medical evacuation. They were small, just a handful of helicopters and pilots. But they would change everything. The helicopters they flew were Bell H-13 Sioux and Hiller H-23 Ravens. These were tiny machines. A single pilot sat in a bubble cockpit. There was no room inside for passengers. Instead, the helicopters had external litter pods, metal frames mounted on either side of the aircraft. A wounded soldier would be strapped to a stretcher and loaded into one of these pods. Completely exposed to the elements. No protection, no comfort. Just a stretcher hanging off the side of a helicopter. It looked insane. And in many ways it was. But it worked. Of course, for millions of people, the image of this little helicopter with its bubble cockpit and external litters is forever linked to one thing: the opening credits of the TV show MASH. That show, which ran for 11 seasons, brought the reality of the Korean War and specifically the frantic, life-saving work of the mobile army surgical hospitals, into living rooms across the world. While the show famously used the Korean War setting to comment on the then ongoing Vietnam War, the depiction of those Bell H-13 Sioux helicopters buzzing over the mountains, carrying wounded soldiers strapped to the outside, became an iconic image. It cemented the helicopter's role as the angel of mercy in the public imagination, even if the show often focused more on the dark humor and emotional toll than the technical specifics of the Medevac revolution. The second helicopter detachment was the first to become operational. On January 1, 1951, they were attached to the 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, the MASH unit. The MASH units were another innovation of the Korean War. They were mobile surgical hospitals that could be set up close to the front lines. Tents. Operating tables made from stretchers balanced on sawhorses. Doctors and nurses working in freezing conditions. The idea was simple. Bring surgery to the battlefield. Don't make the wounded travel hundreds of miles to get help. Bring the help to them. The combination of MASH units and helicopter medevac was revolutionary. A soldier could be wounded on the front lines, loaded onto a helicopter within minutes, and flown directly to a MASH unit. From injury to surgery in under an hour, sometimes in under 30 minutes. This was unheard of. In World War II, it took hours or days. Now it took minutes. The results were immediate and dramatic. Soldiers who would have died from blood loss survived. Soldiers who would have gone into shock from a long, bumpy ambulance ride arrived stable. Soldiers who would have died from untreated internal injuries got surgery in time. The mortality rate started dropping. By the end of 1951, it was clear that helicopter medevac was working. But the pilots were facing challenges no one had anticipated. The helicopters used for medevac in Korea were not designed for combat. They were fragile. They had no armor. They were slow. They had limited range. And they were vulnerable to enemy fire. The Bell H-13 had a maximum speed of about 90 miles per hour. It could fly for maybe 2 hours before needing fuel. Its engine was prone to overheating. Its rotor blades could be damaged by even small arms fire. And it had no defensive weapons. None. If the enemy shot at you, your only option was to fly away. If you could. The pilots had no formal training in casualty care. They were aviators, not medics. But they learned quickly. They learned how to load wounded soldiers into the litter pods gently. They learned how to fly smoothly to minimize pain. They learned how to talk to frightened, dying men and keep them calm. The early H-13 helicopters had no radios, no instrument lights, no navigation equipment. If you flew at night, you held a flashlight between your knees to see your instruments. If you needed to communicate with ground forces, you used colored smoke grenades and hand signals. Landing zones were often under enemy fire. You'd fly into a hot zone, land, load the wounded, and take off, all while bullets were flying. Some pilots were shot down. Some were wounded. Some were killed. But they kept flying, because they knew lives depended on them. The official policy said helicopters should only evacuate casualties from rear aid stations, not from the front lines. Too dangerous. They also said no night missions. Too risky. But the pilots ignored those rules constantly. If a unit called for help, the pilots flew. Front lines, night, bad weather. It didn't matter. They flew anyway. First Lieutenant Joseph Bowler set a record. 824 medical evacuations in 10 months. He flew mission after mission, day after day. saving lives one flight at a time. The pilots became heroes to the troops. Soldiers on the front lines knew that if they were wounded, a helicopter would come for them. Even if they were cut off, even if they were surrounded, even if it seemed impossible, the helicopter would come. That knowledge boosted morale in ways no one had predicted. Soldiers fought harder knowing they wouldn't be left behind. They took risks knowing that if things went wrong, help was just minutes away. And the helicopters kept coming. The impact of helicopter Medevac on survival rates was staggering. In World War II, 4.5% of wounded soldiers who reached medical care died from their wounds. In Korea, that number dropped to 2.5%. Almost cut in half. Think about what that means. Thousands of soldiers who would have died in World War II survived in Korea, because they got to surgery faster, because helicopters brought them to MASH units in minutes instead of hours, because speed saved lives. On February 20th, 1951, helicopters evacuated 750 critically wounded soldiers in a single day. One day, 750 lives. A surgeon later said that half of those men would have died if they'd been transported by a ground ambulance. Half. That's 375 lives saved. In one day. By helicopters. The numbers over the entire war are even more dramatic. Helicopter detachments evacuated more than 21,000 casualties during the Korean War. 21,000. The Marine Corps evacuated another 9,815 wounded. That's over 30,000 lives touched by helicopter Medevac. How many of those soldiers would have died without helicopters? We can't know for sure, but based on World War II mortality rates, probably thousands. The helicopter didn't just save individual lives, it changed the entire nature of battlefield medicine. It proved that the golden hour concept worked. The golden hour is the critical period after a traumatic injury when medical intervention is most likely to prevent death or long-term disability. Get a wounded soldier to surgery within that hour, and his chances of survival skyrocket. Miss that window, and the chances drop dramatically. Helicopters made the golden hour possible. They could fly a wounded soldier from the front lines to a MASH unit in 15 to 30 minutes. Well within the golden hour. Ground ambulances couldn't do that. They took too long. They got stuck. They broke down. Helicopters didn't have those problems. They flew over mountains, over rivers, over enemy positions, straight to the MASH unit. Fast. Direct, life-saving. The helicopter Medevac system developed in Korea would become the template for every future conflict. Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Every modern conflict uses helicopter Medevac. Because it works, because it saves lives. And it all started in Korea. The helicopters weren't just saving lives, they were changing the way wars were fought. Before Korea, armies had to plan around medical logistics. How do we evacuate wounded? How do we set up field hospitals? How do we keep supply lines open for ambulances? Helicopters simplified all of that. They could fly over obstacles. They didn't need roads. They could reach isolated units that were cut off. This gave commanders more flexibility. They could send troops into mountainous terrain, knowing that if soldiers were wounded, helicopters could get them out. They could hold defensive positions longer because medical evacuation wasn't dependent on keeping roads open. They could take risks that would have been suicidal in World War II. The helicopters also had a psychological impact on the enemy. North Korean and Chinese forces learned to fear the sound of helicopter rotors, because when they heard that sound, they knew wounded American soldiers were being evacuated. They knew those soldiers would survive. They knew the Americans had a system that worked. It was demoralizing. Some enemy forces specifically targeted helicopters. They knew how important they were. Shooting down a Medevac helicopter wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological blow. But even that didn't stop the pilots. They kept flying, because the alternative was letting soldiers die, and that was unacceptable. By 1953, the helicopter had proven itself beyond any doubt. It wasn't just a useful tool, it was an essential part of modern warfare. The Army expanded its helicopter fleet. More detachments, more pilots, more helicopters. The Bell H-13 was joined by larger helicopters like the Sikorsky H-19 Chickasaw. The H-19 could carry 4 to 6 litters. It had more power, more range, more capability. But the principle was the same. Get wounded soldiers to surgery fast. Save lives. Win the war. The success of helicopter medevac in Korea influenced civilian medicine as well. After the war, hospitals started using helicopters for emergency medical transport. The first civilian air ambulance services were modeled on military medevac. Today, medical helicopters are everywhere. Life flight, air ambulance, medevac. They save lives every single day. And it all goes back to Korea, to Captain Oscar Tibbets and that first mission in August 1950. To the pilots who flew into enemy fire with no armor and no weapons. To the soldiers who were strapped into litter pods and flown to safety. To the MASH unit, doctors who operated in tents with stretchers on sawhorses. They changed everything. But here's the thing. At the time, not everyone believed helicopter medevac was that important. Some historians later argued that helicopters didn't actually make that much difference. They pointed out that helicopters arrived late in the war, after the heaviest casualties had already occurred. They noted that relatively few helicopters were available. They argued that most wounded soldiers were still evacuated by ground ambulance, not helicopter. And they said the drop in mortality from 4.5% to 2.5% was due to multiple factors, not just helicopters. Better antibiotics, better surgical techniques, better training, the MASH units themselves. All of that was true, but it missed the point. Yes, helicopters didn't evacuate most casualties, they evacuated the worst casualties. The soldiers who were cut off, the soldiers who would have died waiting for a ground ambulance, the soldiers who needed surgery right now, not in 3 hours. Those were the lives helicopters saved. And yes, there were other improvements in medical care, but helicopters made all of those improvements more effective. What good is a MASH unit if wounded soldiers can't reach it in time? What good are advanced surgical techniques if the patient dies before surgery? What good are antibiotics if the soldier bleeds out before you can administer them? The helicopter was the link that made everything else work. It was the delivery system that made modern battlefield medicine possible. The soldiers who were saved knew this. The pilots who flew the missions knew this. The doctors who operated on patients who arrived alive when they would have arrived dead in World War II, they knew this. The numbers don't lie. Mortality dropped. Survival rates increased. Thousands of lives were saved. The helicopter made the difference. Let's talk about the pilots for a moment, because these were extraordinary men doing extraordinary things. They were mostly young, in their 20s. Many had learned to fly during or right after World War II. They weren't flying sleek fighter jets or heavy bombers. They were flying small, fragile helicopters that looked like flying insects, and they were flying them into combat, with no weapons, no armor, nothing to protect them except skill and luck. They flew in all conditions: rain, snow, fog, mountains. They flew at night with nothing but a flashlight to see their instruments. They flew into landing zones under enemy fire. They flew when their helicopters were falling apart from lack of maintenance, because there weren't enough spare parts, because the helicopters were working harder than they were designed to work, because every day brought more casualties, more missions, more lives to save. The pilots developed incredible skill. They learned to land on mountain peaks, on narrow ridges, in rice paddies, in forests. They learned to judge wind and weather by feel. They learned to fly through valleys at low altitude to avoid enemy fire. They learned to fly with wounded soldiers strapped to the outside of their helicopters, exposed to the elements, and to fly smoothly so they wouldn't make the soldiers' pain worse. Some pilots were shot down and wounded. They recovered and went back to flying. Some were killed. Their names are mostly forgotten now. No movies were made about them. No best-selling books. They weren't fighter races. They weren't glamorous. They were Medevac pilots. But they were heroes. Every single one of them. Because they flew when no one else would. Because they saved lives when no one else could. Because they proved that courage isn't about shooting the enemy. Sometimes courage is about flying into danger unarmed, to save a life, to bring a wounded soldier home. That's the kind of courage the Medevac pilots showed. Every day, every mission, for 3 years. And thousands of soldiers came home because of them. The legacy of Korean War helicopter Medevac is everywhere. In Vietnam, helicopter Medevac became standard. The famous Huey, dust-off missions, thousands of lives saved. In the Gulf War, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, helicopter Medevac was always there. Soldiers knew that if they were wounded, the Medevac would come. In civilian life, medical helicopters transport accident victims, heart attack patients, trauma cases. Hospitals have helipads. Air ambulance services operate in every state. The golden hour concept applies to civilians just like it applied to soldiers in Korea. Get to the hospital fast. Save the life. It all goes back to Korea. To August 1950. To Captain Oscar Tibbets and the 3rd Air Rescue Squadron. To that first mission. That first life saved. Today, when you see a medical helicopter flying overhead, remember where it came from. Remember the Bell H-13 with its external litter pods. Remember the pilots who flew into enemy fire. Remember the soldiers who were strapped to stretchers on the outside of helicopters and flown to safety. Remember the MASH units. Remember the golden hour. Remember that speed saves lives. And remember that sometimes the most important weapon in war isn't a weapon at all. Sometimes it's a small, fragile helicopter. Sometimes it's a pilot willing to risk everything. Sometimes it's a system that says, "We will not leave you behind. We will come for you. We will save you." That's what the helicopter meant in Korea. That's what it still means today. The Bell H-13 helicopter wasn't perfect. It was slow, fragile, vulnerable. It couldn't fly at night or in bad weather. It had no weapons, no armor. It could only carry 2 casualties at a time. But it did something no other machine could do. It saved lives. Thousands of them. It cut the death rate for wounded soldiers almost in half. It proved that the golden hour concept worked. It showed that speed, not distance, was what mattered in medical evacuation. It changed the way wars are fought. It changed the way medicine is practiced. It saved soldiers who would have died in any previous war. And it did all of this in just 3 years. 3 years that changed everything. Today, military and civilian medical helicopters save lives around the world every single day. That legacy started in Korea, in the mountains and valleys where young pilots flew tiny helicopters into impossible situations, where MASH unit doctors operated in tents, where wounded soldiers were strapped to litter pods and flown to safety. The helicopter didn't just save lives in Korea, it saved the idea that every life is worth saving, that no soldier should be left behind, that we will come for you no matter what, no matter where you are, no matter how dangerous it is. We will come. That's the promise the helicopter made in Korea.